Why was she still awake, hours before the rest of the base even stirred? Sarah Martinez knelt in the dirt, the cold steel of her rifle stretched across her lap like some sacred relic. The rising Afghan sun spilled over the mountains, painting the valley in gold, and she moved her hands with quiet devotion, running the cleaning rod through the barrel as if polishing away not just grit, but the invisible weight of every life that weapon had already taken. Others would call it routine maintenance. For Sarah, it was something else. A ritual, a form of survival, a way of steadying her own restless thoughts. The base around her was still half asleep after days of back-to-back patrols. Boots shuffled lazily in distant tents, muffled voices called out in yawns and laughter. But Sarah preferred silence. She craved the moments when only the sound of the cleaning cloth sliding against steel filled her ears. Here, no one asked questions. No one reminded her of numbers or confirmed kills. No one looked at her with that mixture of awe and unease. Her reputation preceded her, whether she wanted it or not. 8 years in uniform. Dozens of missions where she had delivered the kind of precision others called impossible. At 29, her name carried weight in briefing rooms she barely spoke in. But records were only numbers, and numbers never told the truth of what it cost to be the one behind the scope. She leaned into her work, disassembling the bolt assembly, fingers moving with the ease of muscle memory. It had been like this since childhood, long before Afghanistan, long before uniforms and ranks. Back in Montana, when her father had taught her to shoot on the ranch, she had learned early that the difference between a clean shot and a failed one was patience. Wind shifts, breath control, respect for the weapon in her hands. Those early mornings hunting elk with her father were still etched into her bones. The stillness, the listening, the weight of waiting until the moment felt right. That memory lingered now, faint but steady, when the crunch of boots broke the silence. She looked up. Sergeant Thompson was walking toward her, carrying 2 cups of coffee, dust swirling around his steps. "Thought you might need this," he said, setting one down beside her kit. She gave the faintest nod. Black coffee, just the way she liked it. Thompson didn't linger with small talk. He never did. He had once been a spotter before logistics pulled him elsewhere, and he understood the silence of her work better than most. He stood there a moment, hands clasped behind his back, as if remembering the weight of those long hours glassing targets through scopes. "Briefing in 30, he said finally. "Looks like movement again. Sector 7. The words hung heavy. Sector 7. That cursed stretch of valley where jagged hills and wind-whipped ridgelines made even the best shooters sweat. Sarah had been there before. Twice. Both times she had walked away with the mission complete, the targets neutralized. But she still remembered the way her heartbeat raced as her finger hovered over the trigger, how the silence afterward seemed louder than the gunfire itself. She didn't answer, didn't need to. Thompson knew she was listening. Her hand stayed busy with the rifle, checking the firing pin, inspecting the scope mount. Every screw, every movement mattered. It wasn't just about mechanics. It was about trust. Trusting that this machine, this extension of her body, would not betray her when the moment demanded perfection. When she was satisfied, she shouldered the weapon. The weight settled into her frame like an old friend, heavy yet familiar. She had fired thousands of rounds through this barrel. Each one had carved a piece of her into the weapon, fusing her identity with its steel. A sniper and her rifle, an intimacy no one outside their world ever truly understood. As the base began to stir, soldiers stumbling toward the mess hall, laughter echoing faintly across the dust, Sarah walked quietly toward the briefing room. Her boots crunched gravel, but her mind was somewhere else, already tracing distances, calculating angles, rehearsing scenarios before she even knew what they were. At the door she paused, centered herself. The world outside faded and the calm slid in like a second skin. She had learned to live this way, breathing slowly, holding thoughts still, never allowing the edges of doubt to slip through. Inside, the air was dim. maps plastered across walls, satellite images glowing on a projector screen. A handful of soldiers took seats, their chatter dying the moment Major Collins stepped forward. His expression was stone, his voice clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a developing situation in Kandahar province that requires immediate attention." On the screen, grainy drone footage flickered, mountains stretching like bones beneath the sun, a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley, paths drawn in red and yellow lines. Sarah's eyes narrowed, already translating elevation, calculating sight lines. "A high-value target has been moving through this compound," Collins continued, laser pointer tapping the image. "Coordinating attacks on supply convoys, fortified multiple escape routes, heavy weapons reported. Conventional assault would be costly." The room grew still. Everyone knew what costly meant. Collins' eyes swept the room, then landed on her. "Staff Sergeant Martinez." Every head turned. Sarah's fingers curled against her knee, her rifle case resting by her side. She felt their eyes on her, not hostile, not admiring, but expectant. The kind of look that reminded her of the space she occupied, useful, necessary, but set apart. "Your expertise may be required for this operation," Collins said flatly. "The distances involved are significant." Significant. That was his word. What he really meant was nearly impossible. Sarah didn't flinch. She just nodded once. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause could ever be. When the briefing ended, she stayed behind. The others filtered out with murmurs of speculation and relief that the mission wasn't theirs. Collins approached with a folder, sliding reconnaissance photos across the table. His tone softened, though only slightly. "What are your thoughts?" She leaned over the map, eyes scanning the ridgelines, tracing possibilities with her finger. Elevations, angles, distances. "The shot's over 3 kilometers," she said finally. "Closer to 4 depending on position." Collins studied her. She continued. "Conditions will be everything. Wind, density, temperature shifts. Minimum 48 hours of reconnaissance before I'd even consider it. 72 would be better. I'll need data at multiple elevations, and a spotter who knows what they're doing." He nodded, jotting notes as she spoke. He wasn't surprised by the demands. If anything, he seemed relieved that she approached the mission with caution rather than bravado. Later that afternoon, she met with Corporal Danny Kim, her spotter for the mission. Reliable, sharp. He had the kind of calm eyes you wanted beside you when everything depended on reading the invisible movements of air across a valley. "We're looking at ranges between 3,200 and 3,800 meters, Sarah told him, pointing across the map. He let out a low whistle. "That's pushing it." She didn't smile. Pushing it, in their world, meant threading a bullet across nearly 4,000 meters of unpredictable atmosphere. It meant 4 seconds of flight time where a shift of air, something no one could see, might carry the round meters off course. Kim understood. He just nodded. "Then we'll need everything perfect." That night Sarah lay awake in her quarters, staring at the ceiling fan spinning in lazy circles. The base was noisy now, boots clattering outside, radios buzzing, laughter from the mess hall carried down the halls. But all she heard was the echo of Collins' voice. Significant. She thought of the man she hadn't met yet, the target whose actions had already left bodies on roadsides, convoys in flames, civilians caught in crossfire. She thought of the distance her bullet would have to travel, of the invisible calculation that would decide whether lives were saved or more were lost. And she thought of her father back on the ranch in Montana, of his voice, steady as he crouched beside her when she was barely old enough to hold a rifle. "It's not about the shot, Sarah. It's about the patience, the respect, the knowing you only get one chance to do it right." She closed her eyes. The mission hadn't even begun and already the weight pressed down. But there was no room for fear, no room for second-guessing. only preparation, only the familiar silence of a rifle in her hands. Tomorrow she would begin. And in the stillness of that Afghan night, Sarah Martinez wondered, not for the first time, how much of herself would be left when it was over. What did it mean to prepare for a shot that almost no one in the world believed possible? Sarah asked herself that question as she sat in the operations tent, dim light spilling across topographical maps, satellite prints, and endless sheets of calculations. Around her, the base buzzed with its usual rhythm, convoys being checked, radios spitting static, distant shouts from soldiers sparring during downtime. But her world had narrowed to lines on paper and numbers scribbled in the margins. 3,200 meters. 3,800. The kind of distances that bent reality, that turned marksmanship into something closer to science than skill. Kim sat across from her, pen tapping against his notebook. He had spread weather reports in front of him, historical patterns that revealed how air moved across the mountains at different times of year. He studied them like a priest searching for divine patterns, his brow furrowed, his lips muttering faint calculations. Crosswinds are the real enemy here, he said at last. At ground level they're manageable, but mid-flight, 4 seconds of bullet travel, that's a lifetime for the wind. Sarah didn't look up from the map. We'll monitor it, multiple levels, every 15 minutes. Kim nodded. He knew she wasn't dismissing him. She was committing it to the invisible checklist she carried inside her head. That invisible book where each item had to be ticked before she'd even consider pulling the trigger. They worked in silence. Hours passed. Soldiers came and went. At some point, Thompson dropped off more coffee and disappeared again, wordlessly. The base commander poked his head in once, checking on their progress, but left when he saw their faces. It was the kind of work no one envied, endless, meticulous, obsessive. For Sarah, it was a strange comfort. The closer she came to a mission, the calmer she became. Planning stripped away fear. Precision gave her control over chaos. And yet, deep down she knew control was only ever an illusion. By late evening, she allowed herself a break. She stepped outside the tent, letting the desert air cool her skin. Above, the stars bled across the sky, impossibly bright. Afghanistan had a way of reminding you how small you were. She thought of the target again, the man hidden deep in those mountains, coordinating attacks that shredded lives in convoys she would never ride in, villages she would never see. The mission wasn't personal, it never was, but it was human. And she carried the weight of that humanity in silence. The next morning, preparation shifted into something physical. Sarah inspected her rifle again, though she had already done it twice the day before. She ran her fingers along the custom stock, adjusted the bipod, checked the trigger tension. Each step was precise, each movement deliberate. Kim appeared with the spotting gear, rangefinders, wind meters, ballistic calculators, spare batteries packed with almost paranoid redundancy. He carried them like a medic carrying life-saving tools, because in their line of work, that's exactly what they were. "You ready?" he asked quietly. Sarah glanced at the rifle in her lap. The steel seemed to glint in the morning sun, cold and indifferent. She exhaled, "As I'll ever be." By the third day, reconnaissance began. The helicopter insertion was planned for pre-dawn, when the valley was still drowned in shadows. They flew low, the rotors whipping up dust storms that stung her eyes as she jumped into the dark. The sound of the blades faded quickly into the mountains, leaving behind silence so thick it pressed against her chest. 8 kilometers to their observation point. 8 kilometers of silence, stealth, and careful movement through terrain that seemed designed to punish the unprepared. Sarah led the way, every step mattered. Loose rock meant sound, and sound meant discovery. She moved like she had been taught to hunt, deliberate, patient, weight balanced through her boots. Behind her, Kim mirrored each movement, his breathing even, his eyes alert. Hours passed. The black sky paled to gray, then to muted gold as dawn threatened the horizon. By the time they crested the final ridge, sweat clung to Sarah's back, though the mountain air was cold. She lowered to her stomach, sliding forward until the valley spilled open beneath her. There it was. The compound. From this distance, it was little more than tiny shapes in a vast landscape. But through high-powered optics, the details sharpened: walls, vehicles, men standing guard, pathways crisscrossing like veins. 3750 meters, Kim whispered after the first reading. His voice held no excitement, no fear, only the calm cadence of numbers. Wind southwest 12 kilometers per hour. At ground, stable. At mid-range, needs watching. Sarah nodded. She let her eyes linger through her scope. The distance stretched, surreal. She could see figures moving, almost fragile in their smallness. Somewhere among them was the man they had come for, a man who believed the mountains made him untouchable. She tracked the buildings, memorizing doorways, sight lines, patrol patterns. Time passed, measured in the quiet tick of her breath. Hours bled together. By afternoon, heat shimmered across the valley, twisting the air like water ripples. Kim muttered about thermal layering, about the way temperature gradients bent trajectories. Sarah logged it silently, building a mental library of conditions she might need to fight against. They rotated shifts through the night. One slept while the other watched. Sarah dozed lightly, every sound dragging her back awake. Her dreams blurred with equations, wind speeds, images of a man walking from one building to another. When she woke, the same man was there, real and alive, moving with almost predictable routine. By dawn of the second day, Sarah had what she needed: guard rotations, vehicle arrivals, weapon emplacements, the target's patterns. She whispered her observations to Kim, who wrote everything with neat precision. "Feasible," she murmured at last. "Barely, but feasible." Kim looked at her. "You think we can pull it off?" Her eyes stayed fixed on the valley. She didn't answer right away. The truth weighed heavier than she wanted to admit. Finally, she said, "If everything is perfect, if the wind doesn't shift, if my hands don't tremble, then maybe." Maybe. That was as close to certainty as she ever allowed herself. They exfiltrated the same way they had come, slipping back through rocks and shadows until the helicopter plucked them from the wilderness. When the rotors lifted them back toward base, Sarah allowed herself a single glance behind. The mountains were still there, indifferent and eternal. Somewhere in their folds, a man continued breathing, unaware that the air itself was being measured and mapped against him. Back at base, the maps returned to the table, the data spread wide. Collins leaned over the documents, his jaw tight. "The rifles rated effective to 2,500 meters, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "This is well beyond that." Sarah didn't argue. He already knew what she was going to say. "With the right conditions, it's possible." "Possible," Collins repeated, "not probable, not likely, just possible." Kim added his quiet support. "Conditions were stable during recon, predictable winds. Best chance will be early morning. Once the sun's up, thermals complicate everything." Collins studied them both. "What's your confidence level?" Sarah paused. Her father's voice returned again, reminding her that arrogance had no place behind a scope. 75%, she said, "if conditions match what we observed." The major exhaled through his nose. He didn't like those odds, but war rarely offered better. As the room emptied, Sarah lingered, her hand resting on the edge of the map. She stared at the red dot marking the compound, stared until her vision blurred and all she saw was the weight of the decision ahead. 3,800 meters. One bullet. 4 seconds of silence. And a choice she would have to live with long after the echo faded. How do you prepare for a moment when failure isn't an option, when even perfection feels uncertain? That question gnawed at Sarah Martinez as she sat at the long wooden table in the secure briefing room. Papers, photographs, ballistic charts, and weather forecasts lay spread before her like puzzle pieces that refused to lock into place. Around her, the walls were lined with screens displaying satellite imagery, wind models, and atmospheric data. Every number mattered. Every decimal point could mean the difference between success and disaster. Kim sat to her right, his posture hunched, pen scratching across his notebook. His eyes flicked from the readings on his portable weather device to the detailed firing models they'd been given by ballistic specialists flown in for consultation. Collins stood at the far end of the room, arms crossed, silent, watching them like a man overseeing something fragile and monumental. The shot, if it happened, wouldn't just be another mission. Everyone in that room knew it. They were on the edge of something historic, something whispered about in the shadows of sniper schools but rarely attempted in reality. A shot beyond 3,800 meters wasn't just technical, it bordered on the impossible. And yet here they were. Sarah picked up one of the cartridges from the batch she had selected, rolling it between her fingers. Match-grade ammunition, hand-inspected, every bullet weighed, every casing examined. She had gone through hundreds, setting aside the slightest imperfection until only the most flawless rounds remained. At this range, even the tiniest inconsistency could shift a bullet's path by feet. "You're obsessing again," Kim murmured without looking up. She didn't answer because he was right, but obsession wasn't a weakness, it was survival. The hours bled into night. They tested scope adjustments with laser alignment tools, checked the bipod for structural stability, verified calibration on every piece of spotting equipment. Kim ran simulations on his ballistic calculator, inputting wind, humidity, temperature, air density. Each scenario spat out numbers, minutes of angle, elevation adjustments, windage holds. Sarah memorized them. Not just the calculations, but the feel of them, the rhythm, the subtle differences between each condition. Numbers became more than data, they became instinct. By midnight, she pushed her chair back, exhaustion pressing against her skull. She walked outside, breathing in the cool night air. The base was quiet, shadows stretching across sandbags and barriers. In the distance, a convoy's headlights moved like fireflies through the dark. She tilted her head back, staring at the stars. And for a moment, she wondered. If she pulled the trigger, if she ended this man's life from nearly 4 kilometers away, would it matter? Would it change the tide of this war? Would it save the soldiers who never even knew her name? Or would it simply be one more silent ripple in an ocean of violence? The questions pressed against her ribs, heavy and familiar. She had asked them before, after every mission, and the answers never came. Instead, her father's voice came again, softer this time, carried on memory. "It's not about the noise, Sarah. It's about the silence after. That's when you find out what you really took away." She closed her eyes. Silence was always louder than the gunshot. The next morning began with physical drills, breathing exercises, stability drills. She lay prone in the dirt outside the base, the rifle pressed to her shoulder, Kim monitoring her form. Each squeeze of the trigger was controlled, deliberate. Her body moved as if rehearsing a dance she had practiced since childhood. Inhale, exhale halfway, pause, squeeze. "Perfect," Kim said quietly. Not praise, just observation. Hours later, they ran through communication drills, timing their calls, refining hand signals, practicing scenarios where the wind shifted mid-flight, where atmospheric conditions changed at the last second. They rehearsed withdrawal routes, extraction timing, contingency plans if they were discovered. Every possibility had to be accounted for. That evening, a military meteorologist briefed them. His voice was steady, clinical, but Sarah clung to every word. Between 0600 and 0800 hours, conditions are projected to be stable. Winds consistent, minimal thermal layering, low humidity. After that, unpredictability increases sharply. The window was narrow, 2 hours, maybe less. If they missed it, the mission would collapse before it began. Later, alone in her quarters, Sarah sat with her rifle disassembled on her lap. She ran the cleaning cloth through the barrel, checked the scope mounts again, verified torque on every screw. It was ritual now, almost prayer. She whispered the numbers under her breath like mantras: 3,827, 4 seconds, 38 meters of drop, consistent wind, trust the math, trust the rifle, trust yourself. But beneath the rhythm something else stirred, a quieter voice, the one she never spoke aloud. And if you miss, what then? She set the bolt down carefully, her hands steady even as her chest tightened. Failure meant more than just wasted effort. Failure meant the man kept living, meant more convoys attacked, more families shattered. But failure also meant she would carry it. The image of a bullet vanishing into mountains, never reaching its mark, a reminder that she had tried and failed when it mattered most. Sleep was thin that night, restless, fractured. She dreamed of Montana again, of elk standing across wide fields, their breaths visible in the cold. She saw herself as a child, small fingers gripping a rifle too big for her frame. Her father beside her, hand on her shoulder. "You'll miss sometimes," he whispered in the dream. "But you'll learn. The question isn't whether you hit. The question is whether you respect what you're aiming at." When she woke, the base was still dark, stars fading into the faintest hints of dawn. Her chest ached with a strange blend of fear and calm. It was almost time. In the final hours before deployment, the atmosphere on base shifted. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones, as if aware something unusual was about to unfold. The mission had filtered through the ranks, though no one knew details. They only knew Sarah was preparing for something extraordinary. Kim met her at the staging area, gear strapped, eyes clear. He handed her a canteen. "Drink, last chance." She nodded, taking a sip, then shouldered her rifle case. The familiar weight anchored her, grounded her. Collins arrived with final instructions. His expression was serious, though Sarah caught the flicker of something else in his eyes, concern, maybe even doubt. "This will be one of the most difficult shots ever attempted under operational conditions," he said. "I want you both to remember, the objective is important, but your lives are more important. If conditions aren't right, you pull out. Understood?" Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "Understood." Kim answered the same. The major hesitated. How do you quiet a storm inside your own chest when the world demands silence? That was the question Sarah wrestled with as she and Kim moved in the pre-dawn darkness, their boots crunching against loose gravel that echoed too loudly in her ears. 3 hours into the approach, every step had been deliberate, rehearsed, calculated. Yet her heartbeat still thudded like a drum she couldn't shut off. The firing position lay ahead, hidden beyond a ridge line that looked no different from any other. But she knew the difference. This one had been chosen after days of recon, after hours of calculations, after nights staring at star charts and weather reports. This ridge was the stage, and she was about to step into a performance where failure wasn't an option. The weapon case pressed against her side, straps tight across her shoulders. Inside was not just a rifle, it was the culmination of months of preparation. Every adjustment, every calibration had been designed for this one impossible shot. Kim carried the spotting gear, his pace steady behind her. Together, they looked like shadows gliding across a sleeping mountain. They crested the ridge as the first hints of dawn bled across the horizon. The valley unfolded below, vast, jagged, timeless. The compound sat like a scar in the landscape, walls squared against the earth, paths threading outward like veins. Even from here, so far away, Sarah could feel the gravity of it. That was the place. That was the target. Kim crouched, setting up his optics. His hands moved quickly, practiced. Within minutes, data streamed quietly between them. Range confirmed. 3,827 meters to the primary entrance. Sarah lowered to her belly, sliding the rifle case open. She assembled the weapon piece by piece, each motion measured. Bipod deployed. Scope aligned. Ammunition laid out in a neat row, every cartridge inspected and identical. The final adjustments were so small they seemed absurd, fractions of clicks on a scope, a whisper of torque on a mount. But at nearly 4 kilometers, fractions mattered. Kim's voice was calm, almost disembodied as he relayed conditions. Barometric pressure steady, wind stable at this elevation, mid-range crosswind shifting east 5 kilometers an hour. Noted. She absorbed it, each number becoming part of the equation forming silently in her head. The math never frightened her, it steadied her. The numbers didn't lie, people did, fear did, but numbers were pure, stripped of morality. They simply told you what was possible. She settled into her position. The stock kissed her cheek, the rifle became her breath. She closed her eyes, inhaled slow, exhaled slower. Her pulse eased, finding its rhythm with the earth beneath her. Through the scope, the world became small. Buildings sharpened. Figures moved in patterns, their lives reduced to silhouettes of habit. She had studied those movements for days. She knew which doorway would open. She knew the man she was here for would emerge as he always did, unaware that the invisible math of the universe was waiting for him. But watching him now, so small, so human, her chest tightened. He wasn't just a target. He was a man with breath in his lungs, thoughts in his head. She didn't know his story, didn't know the names of the people he commanded, didn't know what fear or pride lived in him. All she knew was the blood he had caused to spill. She whispered to herself, "This isn't about vengeance. This is about prevention." The words helped, but they didn't silence the unease. Kim's voice pulled her back. Target approaching the primary building, movement consistent with pattern. Sarah's finger rested lightly on the trigger, not pressing, not even threatening. Just there, the connection between decision and consequence. "Conditions remain stable," Kim said. "You've got your window, 60 seconds. Her body stilled, every nerve, every muscle locked into balance. Her breathing slowed until only the faint rise and fall of her chest betrayed that she was alive. Through the scope, the man walked toward the doorway. His pace was steady, unhurried. He had no idea. Sarah inhaled deeply, then exhaled half. She entered the natural pause, the stillness between breaths where life itself seemed to hold. Her finger took up the slack of the trigger, weight balanced to the ounce. The world narrowed, only the scope, only the man. Only the line between calculation and fate. "Send it," Kim whispered. The rifle cracked. The sound tore across the ridge, echoing back in waves, but Sarah didn't hear it. Not really. She was focused on the flight. 4 seconds. That's what it took. 4 seconds where a bullet cut through layers of invisible air, bending and twisting under laws no one could see. She kept her scope on target, waiting, waiting, waiting. A figure dropped. Chaos rippled through the compound. Men scrambled, shouting, pointing in all directions. "Impact confirmed," Kim said softly, voice tight with awe. "Target down, clean hit." Sarah exhaled at last. The sound trembled against her lips. Her body didn't move, not yet. She stayed behind the scope, eyes fixed on the confusion below. Her finger slipped from the trigger, hand hovering over the rifle as though letting go too quickly would undo what had been done. The target was gone, the mission complete. And yet a hollowness opened in her chest. She had achieved something almost no one else on Earth could have. A shot at 3,827 meters, a record, a marvel of calculation and skill. But all she could think was, "A man is dead, because of me." She whispered the words to herself, silent enough that even Kim didn't hear. It had to be done. But silence carried no absolution. Kim began recording conditions, logging wind, temperature, atmospheric data. He spoke clinically, his professionalism filling the space where her thoughts churned. She forced herself to pack the rifle, each piece disassembled with mechanical precision. That was the ritual. That was how you survived. The echo of the shot hadn't even reached the compound yet when the two of them were already moving, slipping back from the ridge line. Behind them, the valley erupted in chaos. Enemy fighters scrambled, searching ridges, scanning horizons. But how could they fathom that the shot had come from nearly 4 kilometers away? How could they imagine that distance itself had become a weapon? Sarah moved quickly but silently, each step carrying the weight of the moment they had just created. Kim followed, his radio crackling with updates from the extraction team. "Search parties mobilizing," he murmured. "But they're confused. They won't find us, not out here." Sarah didn't answer. She just kept moving, her mind caught between pride and burden, between record and responsibility. By the time they reached the extraction point, the mountains behind them seemed almost indifferent, as though they hadn't just witnessed history. The helicopter swept in low, rotors chopping the air, and Sarah felt the vibrations pulse through her chest as she climbed aboard. Inside the aircraft, she finally set her rifle down, securing it beside her. The weapon gleamed in the dull light, flawless, untouchable. But she couldn't look at it without seeing the man fall, without hearing the silence of those 4 seconds stretched into eternity. Kim sat opposite her, scribbling notes, his expression tight with focus. But when he looked up, their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was no need. Both of them knew what had just happened. Both of them knew what it had cost. The helicopter lifted, the compound shrinking to nothing in the distance. Dust rose, mountains blurred, and the mission was over. But Sarah understood the truth. The mission never really ended. Not in the heart. The record would stand. The world would whisper about it in briefing rooms and history books. But for her, it would always remain what it was in that moment. One breath, one trigger, one man who would never breathe again. And as the helicopter carried her back toward base, Sarah closed her eyes and let the moral weight settle where it always did, deep, silent, and unseen. Why did victory feel so hollow? That was the thought circling in Sarah's mind as the helicopter touched down at the base, its rotors whipping dust across the landing pad. Soldiers rushed forward, some out of duty, some out of curiosity, because word had already spread. The shot had been fired. The target was down. The impossible had been done. But Sarah didn't feel the triumph buzzing in the air around her. She only felt the weight of the rifle in her hands, heavier than before, as though it carried not just steel and carbon but the soul of the man who would never stand again. Major Collins was waiting. His posture was sharp, his face unreadable, but Sarah caught the flicker of something in his eyes, relief, pride, maybe even disbelief. "Confirmed kill?" he asked. "Confirmed," Sarah said flatly. Her voice was steady, controlled, but inside she was still counting those 4 seconds, still hearing them stretch into forever. Kim added details in the calm voice of a professional. "Single shot, direct hit, 3,827 meters. No return fire. Extraction clean." The major gave a slow nod. Around them, others lingered at a respectful distance, whispering about numbers, about records, about something that shouldn't have been possible but now was. Sarah ignored them. She bent, secured her rifle case, and followed Collins toward the debriefing room. The room was sterile, filled with screens and maps, the kind of place where lives were reduced to data points and outcomes. Ballistics experts had already patched in through video links, their voices filtered through speakers as they demanded details. "Confirm flight time." 3.88 seconds, Kim answered without hesitation. "Atmospheric stability." "Minimal variance, barometric pressure steady." "What about wind drift?" The questions kept coming. Sarah sat in silence while Kim relayed the conditions, while Collins reviewed maps, while engineers and meteorologists and tactical officers analyzed the shot as if it were a formula on a chalkboard. Finally, someone asked the question directly to her. "Staff Sergeant Martinez, what was your confidence level when you fired?" Sarah met the camera lens as if it were a pair of eyes. "I don't think about confidence when I pull the trigger. I think about necessity. I think about whether the shot needs to be taken. And then I take it." The room fell silent for a moment. The answer wasn't what they expected, but it was the truth. Hours passed, reports were written, data was logged. Her rifle was taken for inspection, every adjustment documented, every cartridge examined. They wanted to know how it had been done. They wanted to break the moment down into science, into mechanics, into something that could be repeated. But Sarah knew it couldn't be repeated. Not really. It had been the alignment of 1,000 variables, whether preparation, timing, patience. Even perfection couldn't guarantee another success at that distance. When the debriefing finally ended, she stepped outside into the harsh Afghan sunlight. The air was dry, hot, and yet she felt cold inside. Soldiers she barely knew gave her nods, small gestures of respect, admiration. Someone muttered, "Longest shot in history." She walked past them without reaction. Records didn't matter. Numbers didn't erase the fact that a human being was gone. Back in her quarters, she sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at the floor. The rifle case leaned against the wall, silent and still, like a locked vault holding secrets no one else would ever understand. Kim appeared in the doorway. He didn't knock, just leaned against the frame, watching her with quiet eyes. "You did it," he said softly. Sarah looked up, her expression unreadable. "We did it." He hesitated, then stepped inside, lowering himself onto the opposite bunk. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy but shared. Finally, Kim said, "You know they're going to talk about this for years. That shot, it's going to be studied, picked apart, turned into legend." Sarah gave a bitter half-smile. "Legends don't carry the nightmares." He didn't argue. He just nodded because he understood. Spotters didn't pull the trigger, but they carried the weight too. Every calculation, every adjustment, every whisper into the sniper's ear, it was as much their bullet as hers. That night Sarah lay awake again, listening to the faint hum of generators outside, the occasional bark of laughter from soldiers still awake. She thought of Montana, of the quiet nights on the ranch where the only sound was wind through the trees. She thought of her father's words, his steady patience. "It's not about glory, Sarah. It's about respect for the shot." Respect, that was the word echoing now. Did she respect what she had done? Could she? In the days that followed, the base buzzed with the aftershocks of her mission. Intelligence confirmed that enemy operations in the region had been disrupted. The loss of their coordinator sent ripples through their network. Supply routes grew safer. Civilian villages reported fewer attacks. The mission had mattered. Lives had been saved. And yet Sarah moved through those days with the same quiet routine as always. Rifle maintenance, training drills, briefings. To others, she was the woman who had bent the limits of possibility. To herself, she was still the one who knelt every morning with her weapon, cleaning it like a ritual, whispering to herself that precision was nothing without restraint. Weeks later, recognition came. Official confirmation that her shot had broken the record for the longest successful sniper engagement in military history. Commendations were filed. Requests for interviews circulated through channels she ignored. Other units wanted her insights, her calculations, her training methods. But when a young soldier approached her one morning on the range, carrying a rifle case and a notebook, his voice unsure as he asked, "Sergeant Martinez, could you show me how you calculated wind at that distance?" Sarah finally felt something stir inside her. Not pride, not glory, something simpler. Responsibility. She nodded, motioned for him to sit. She opened his case, adjusted his scope, corrected his posture. Her voice was calm, patient, the way her father's had once been with her. She explained the fundamentals, the basics that mattered long before anyone even thought of extreme distances. And as she spoke, she realized the truth. Her record didn't matter. What mattered was passing on the discipline, the patience, the respect. Because someday, another young soldier might find themselves lying on a ridge line, staring through a scope, knowing that one breath and one trigger could change everything. Sarah's record would fade eventually. All records did. But if she could teach others to face the silence with dignity, to balance the weight of life and duty with care, then maybe the legacy wasn't the distance of a shot. Maybe the legacy was how you carried it afterward. That night, sitting alone once again with her rifle across her lap, Sarah whispered the words that had become her silent creed. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And with that, she began cleaning her weapon again, the same way she always did, the ritual unbroken, the cycle continuing. Because in the end, her story wasn't about a single shot. It was about every choice before it, and every breath after. What do you dream about after breaking history with a single shot? For Sarah, the answer came in fragments. She dreamed of valleys that stretched endlessly, of scopes that never focused, of a trigger that refused to break no matter how much pressure she applied. Sometimes she dreamed of the man she had killed, never clearly, always blurred at the edges, as if her own mind refused to grant him a face. In those dreams, he didn't fall. He simply stood there, waiting, staring at her through glass that magnified the weight of his gaze. She woke from those dreams with her chest tight, her hands slick with sweat. But she never made a sound. She didn't call out. She didn't stir the others in the barracks. Silence was as much her refuge in sleep as it was behind the scope. By day, the base carried on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Convoys rolled. Patrols returned with dust on their boots and fatigue in their eyes. Life continued, yet whispers followed her everywhere. Soldiers who had never spoken to her before offered stiff nods. Young recruits stared with a mix of awe and unease. Officers treated her like a weapon that had proven its edge. Sarah didn't want whispers. She didn't want awe. She wanted the quiet mornings when the rifle lay across her lap and the only sound was the slow, careful rhythm of cleaning. But whispers were unavoidable. Kim saw it too. He catch the sideways glances, the murmured conversations that died when they entered a room. One evening, as they sat over cold rations, he leaned closer and said, "They don't know what to do with you." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You proved something they thought was impossible," he explained. "That makes them proud, but it also makes them uneasy, because if you can do that, what else are you capable of?" She gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "They think I'm dangerous. They think you're different." Different. It was the word that had shadowed her for years. Even among her own, she was apart. Snipers always were isolated by the nature of their work, set apart by patience, by silence, by the invisible line they walked between mathematics and morality. But this shot, this record, had drawn the line deeper. In the weeks that followed, Sarah kept her routine: maintenance, training, preparation. It was the rhythm that kept her sane. Yet beneath that rhythm, something shifted. The base had moved on from the mission, but she hadn't. At night, she walked the perimeter, alone under the stars, her boots crunching softly in the dirt. The air smelled of dust and oil, of smoke from distant fires. She breathed it in steady, as though the desert itself might steady her in return. Sometimes she found herself staring toward the mountains where it had all happened. The ridges stood in silence, unchanged, as though they hadn't witnessed history. But Sarah remembered. She always remembered. One night, Thompson found her there. He approached quietly, as if careful not to intrude, but Sarah had already heard his boots long before he came into view. "You don't sleep much anymore," he said simply. "Never did," she replied. He studied her in the half-light, the lines of fatigue etched into her face, the way her hands stayed close to her sides, always ready. "That shot, it's going to follow you. You know that, right?" Sarah didn't answer. Thompson sighed, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't let it define you. Records are numbers, but you're more than numbers." When he walked away, the words lingered like an unfinished equation in her mind. The days blurred together. Sarah found herself called into meetings with officers she had never worked with before. They asked her to explain, to break down the shot into lessons, to share her methods with younger snipers in training. She did it, not because she sought recognition, but because she believed knowledge should be passed on. She showed them scope calibration, explained wind patterns, emphasized patience. She reminded them that the fundamentals mattered more than distance. But as she spoke, she watched their eyes. Some listened with reverence, others with hunger, hunger for glory, hunger for the record, and that frightened her. One evening she sat alone with her rifle, the lamp casting a warm glow across the steel. She traced her fingers along the barrel, whispering to herself, "You're not a trophy, you're not a legend, you're a tool, nothing more." Yet part of her knew that wasn't true. Tools didn't make history. Tools didn't haunt dreams. Kim noticed the shift in her. He always did. One night as they walked back from the range, he asked, "Do you regret it?" She didn't answer right away. The question deserved silence before truth. Finally, she said, "I don't regret stopping him. I regret how easy it was for me to do it." Kim didn't speak. He didn't need to. He understood the confession for what it was, a glimpse into the burden that came not from failure but from success. The military recognized her achievement officially a month later. A ceremony was planned, commendations awarded. She stood there in the desert sun, uniform pressed, expression composed as officers praised her professionalism, her discipline, her marksmanship. Applause followed. Cameras clicked. Inside, she felt nothing. When it was over, she returned to her quarters, closed the door, and sat in silence. The medal lay on the table, gleaming in the dim light. She stared at it for a long time before finally pushing it aside. It wasn't the medal that mattered. It wasn't the record. It was the memory of a man falling in silence, the chaos that rippled afterward, the knowledge that she had pulled the thread that unraveled lives. That night she dreamed again. The man stood in the doorway of the compound, but this time when she fired, the bullet never arrived. It hung in the air between them, suspended, waiting. He turned slowly and looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not hate, not fear, but recognition. She woke with a start, her breath ragged, her heart racing. She sat up in bed, clutching her knees, whispering to herself over and over, "It had to be done. It had to be done." But the dream didn't fade. By dawn, she was back at her cleaning station, rifle across her lap, the same ritual, the same silence, the same long shadows cast by the morning sun. Soldiers passed by, some greeting her, others leaving her in peace. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. Her hands moved methodically, but her mind replayed the same question again and again. Was respect enough to carry the weight of a life? She didn't know the answer. Maybe she never would. But as she finished the last piece, as the bolt clicked into place, she felt the faintest steadiness return. The ritual held her together when nothing else could. She closed her eyes, exhaled slowly, and whispered the only truth she trusted anymore. You can't measure dignity in meters, only in silence. And in that silence, she kept breathing. Why do the young always look at the experienced as if they hold answers? Sarah asked herself that question one morning as she sat on the range, rifle balanced across her lap, when a new recruit shuffled toward her with hesitant steps. He couldn't have been more than 20. His hands trembled slightly as he carried his rifle case, his eyes darting between the weapon and her, as if unsure which deserved more respect. "Sergeant Martinez," he said, voice catching on the words, could you show me how you read wind at distance?" Sarah studied him for a long moment. His posture was stiff, eager, uncertain. She remembered when she had looked like that, back in Montana on the ranch, when her father had first handed her a rifle almost too heavy for her arms. She remembered the awe she felt then, the mixture of fear and excitement, the desire to be seen as capable. "Sit," she said simply. He dropped to the ground beside her, opening his case with clumsy hands. She didn't comment on it. Instead, she watched quietly, letting him reveal his habits, his weaknesses, his gaps. He fumbled with the scope, over-tightened a mount, adjusted his cheek weld incorrectly. She said nothing until he looked at her, uncertain, waiting for correction. Fundamentals, Sarah said softly. Before you think about distance, before you think about numbers, get the basics right. The rifle has to fit you like a second skin. If it doesn't, nothing else matters. She adjusted his grip, repositioned his elbow, realigned the scope. Her hands were steady, her movements patient. She spoke the way her father once had, calm, deliberate, never rushing. Distance isn't about glory, she told him. It's about discipline. Wind is just one variable. You'll have dozens more, but you'll never get them right if you don't respect the fundamentals. The recruit nodded eagerly, scribbling notes in the small book he carried. She almost smiled at the sight, because she remembered herself at that age, scribbling equations in the margins of her father's old hunting guides. More recruits came in the days that followed. Word spread quickly across the base. If you wanted to understand patience, if you wanted to learn respect for the rifle, you sought out Martinez. Some approached her nervously, others with open curiosity. A few came with the wrong kind of hunger, the gleam in their eyes that spoke of wanting records, not readiness. Those she was hardest on. You don't chase distance, she told them bluntly. You let it come when everything else is perfect. If you try to force it, you'll miss. And when you miss, someone pays the price. Sometimes they looked disappointed, sometimes confused, but she always saw the lesson land eventually. At night, after the range emptied and the sun dipped low, Sarah would sit alone, staring at the mountains. She thought about legacy, not hers, but the legacy of knowledge. A record might last years, maybe decades, but it would fade. Someone someday would shoot farther. Someone would break the number. But the principles, the fundamentals, those could outlast her if she taught them right. One evening, Kim joined her, sitting quietly beside her as the sky deepened to indigo. They watched the last traces of sunlight fade, the stars emerging one by one. "You're becoming a teacher," he said. Sarah shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just making sure they don't make the same mistakes I almost did." Kim tilted his head, studying her. "You think of that shot as a mistake." She was silent for a long time. Finally, she said, "Not the shot. The way I carried it afterward, I let it hollow me out. They don't need that. They need to understand that skill means nothing without purpose." Kim nodded slowly. "Purpose, that's the part they don't teach in manuals." She gave a faint smile. "That's the part they can't teach." Weeks passed. Missions came and went. Sarah went on a few, her rifle steady as ever, her calculations flawless. But none carried the same weight as the shot across the valley. None lingered in her chest the way that one had. And she was grateful. Grateful for missions that were straightforward, that didn't gnaw at her in the silence of night. But the whispers never fully stopped. Officers still referenced her name in briefings. Recruits still looked at her like a living legend. And Sarah grew used to the contradiction, respected, admired, and yet utterly alone in the experience of what she had done. One night, while cleaning her rifle under the pale glow of a lantern, she caught herself thinking of her father again, of his weathered hands guiding hers, of his voice telling her that hunting was never about trophies. It was about balance, between predator and prey, between skill and respect. She wondered what he would say now, if he knew the distance she had sent a bullet, if he knew the history she had carved in silence. She imagined his answer. "Did you respect the moment, Sarah? Did you respect yourself in it?" She closed her eyes. She wanted to believe she had, but belief was fragile. The next morning, another young soldier approached her. This one carried himself with more confidence, but his eyes betrayed the same mix of fear and determination. "Sergeant," he said, "they say you hold the record. They say no one has ever done what you've done." Sarah studied him quietly. "Records don't matter." He looked startled, even a little disappointed. "But doesn't it feel good to be the best?" She shook her head slowly. "Being the best at taking a life isn't something you celebrate. What matters is whether the life you took saves others. That's the only measure that counts." The recruit fell silent, then slowly he nodded. As he walked away, Sarah felt the faintest sense of relief. Maybe he understood, maybe not, but at least the seed had been planted. That night, as the base quieted and the stars spread across the Afghan sky, Sarah sat with her rifle once more. The medal from her commendation sat untouched in a drawer. The record was already being studied, analyzed, celebrated by people who would never lie on a ridge line with the weight of silence pressing down on their chest. But Sarah didn't need any of that. Her legacy wasn't a number. It wasn't a bullet flight time measured in seconds. It wasn't the echo of a shot that stretched across valleys. Her legacy was the patience she could pass on, the discipline she could teach, the respect she could instill in those who would follow. And as she sat there, the rifle gleaming softly in the lamplight, she whispered to herself, not for the first time, not for the last. Sometimes, the greatest victories are the ones no one sees. The words lingered in the silence, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to peace. What happens when history forgets you? Sarah wondered that as she sat alone in the pale light of dawn, rifle balanced across her lap, her hands moving through the familiar rhythm of cleaning. The bass stirred slowly around her, voices rising from the mess hall, boots crunching on gravel, radios crackling with orders. Life carried on. Missions continued. New soldiers arrived, others rotated out. And the record shot. Already it was becoming something else. A statistic, a number in a file, a story told in hushed tones to recruits, polished by repetition until it shimmered with legend. But Sarah knew the truth. She had lived those 4 seconds of silence, had felt time stretch until it broke, had watched a man collapse from nearly 4 kilometers away. That truth wasn't glory. It wasn't pride. It was weight. She carried it still. Weeks turned into months. She trained others. She spoke less of numbers and more of fundamentals, reminding young soldiers that the rifle was not about distance but about discipline. She taught them how to wait, how to breathe, how to listen to silence. Some understood, some didn't, but she kept teaching anyway because passing it on was the only way she knew to turn her burden into something useful. Kim had been reassigned, pulled into training roles back in the States. Before he left, he clasped her shoulder and said, "You don't have to carry it alone." But she did. That was the nature of the work. Every sniper knew it. Every soldier who had ever looked through glass and pulled a trigger understood that some things couldn't be shared, only endured. Sarah endured quietly. Sometimes at night she walked the perimeter of the base, alone under the stars. She would pause and look toward the distant ridges, toward the valley where the impossible had happened. The mountains stood in silence, indifferent, eternal. They didn't care about records or medals. They didn't care about the whispers of men. And in their indifference, Sarah found something like comfort. One evening, a young sniper approached her with a question. His voice was hesitant, unsure, like so many before him. "Sergeant, how do you know when to take the shot?" Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she said quietly, "You don't. Not with certainty. All you have are calculations, conditions, instincts. You weigh them, you breathe, and then you decide. And you live with whatever that decision costs." The young soldier frowned, perhaps expecting something simpler. But Sarah saw his eyes soften, saw understanding flicker even through his uncertainty. She nodded once, dismissing him, and returned to her rifle. That was the truth. That was always the truth. Months later, confirmation arrived officially. Her shot had been recognized as the longest successful sniper engagement in recorded history. The news spread quickly through military channels, then to the outside world. Articles were written. Analysts debated. The number, 3,827 meters, was repeated again and again, a symbol of precision and human skill. But Sarah didn't read the articles. She didn't care about the debates. She wasn't interested in history books or headlines. To her, it was still just a morning in Afghanistan, a ridge line, a scope, 4 seconds of silence, and a life that ended because she had breathed at the right moment and pulled the trigger. When other soldiers congratulated her, she nodded politely but never lingered. When commanders praised her discipline, she answered formally but without warmth. When asked to share her story, she offered only the technical details, never the weight behind them. Because some truths weren't meant for stories. One morning, as the Afghan sun rose and long shadows stretched across the base, Sarah once again knelt with her rifle, cleaning each piece with the same methodical care she always had. The weapon gleamed in the light, precise, flawless. To others, it was history. To her, it was simply survival. Footsteps approached. A young soldier stopped beside her, rifle case in hand. His voice was respectful, steady. "Sergeant Martinez, could you show me the proper way to calibrate for long distance?" Sarah looked up at him, her expression softening just slightly. She gestured for him to sit. Together, they opened the case, checked the scope, adjusted the mounts. Her voice was calm, her hands steady. She explained not just how, but why. And as she spoke, she realized something. Her legacy wasn't the shot. It wasn't the number or the record. It wasn't history books or medals or whispers in briefing rooms. Her legacy was this: the quiet moment of passing knowledge to the next soldier, the patience she could give them, the respect she could instill, the understanding that distance was never about glory, it was about responsibility. As the lesson ended, the young soldier thanked her, his eyes brighter with understanding. He walked away with his rifle case, shoulders straighter than before. Sarah turned back to her weapon, finished her cleaning, and set it down. She stared at it for a long time, then out at the horizon. The mountains were still there, silent, indifferent, eternal. And in that silence, Sarah finally understood. Her story wasn't about breaking records. It wasn't about proving the impossible. It wasn't even about the man who had fallen at the far end of her scope. It was about carrying dignity in silence, about acting with precision and restraint, about understanding that strength was not measured in meters, but in how you lived with the choices you made. Sarah exhaled, the breath steady, calm, resolved. She whispered the words to herself, the same ones that had carried her through every mission, every moment of wait. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And with that she rose, shouldered her rifle, and walked into another day, quiet, steady, and unseen.